Great. All right. So everyone, again, thank you and welcome. This is the second briefing in our new Declaration briefing series. These calls, we envision them as a way to delve into the principles and the concepts that underpin the Declaration of the rights held by future generations. We wanted to discuss these concepts. What do they mean? How can they be applied in the world? Most importantly, we wanted to bring everyone together to explore how to translate these ideas into concrete action in our communities. So we encourage everyone to, engage in the calls, engage with the Declaration, and to use it in your communities and in the work that you do. Our hope is that the resources that come out of these calls can help us do that. So today's call, we will focus on one of the guiding principles of the Declaration, the rights of nature. And it is my pleasure to introduce Robin Millam, the Administrative Director at the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, and an active integral participant in the Northern California Circle of the Women's Congress for Future Generations. I've mentioned this earlier, but everyone, if you wouldn't mind pressing *6 to mute your line while Robin is presenting. When she's finished, we'll have a moment for some yummy discussion, at which point you can press *6 to unmute your line. And before I pass it on to Robin, I'll just say I encourage everyone to go and visit our Declaration blog. There's a lot of information and resources on there, from past briefing calls, upcoming briefing calls, and some of the really inspirational work that's coming out of regional circles with the Declaration. At that, I will pass it on to you, Robin.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to have this dialogue with you. I want to do a couple things today on our call. One is I want to talk specifically about what do we mean by rights of nature and do some clarifications around what is rights of nature and also what it's not. And we will also talk about how it relates to the overall rights for future and responsibilities for future generations. And I also want to give you an update in terms of what's happening around the world with rights of nature so that you understand that it's not an idea that we want to have happen. It is actually happening in the United States. We've got over 36 communities in the U.S. that have adopted rights of nature, as well as 2 countries, Ecuador and Bolivia. So it is a movement that is well underway. So let me start by saying that when we talk about rights of nature, in its broadest sense, we're really talking about reshaping our worldview and remembering or reconnecting with our right relationship as humans with our planet, and the recognition that we are, as humans, are actually an integral part of the overall biosphere. And part of the focus and intention with rights of nature and the recognition of the rights of that all life, however you want to define that, because for many of us, we really understand that the rocks and elements are also life forms, and that all forms of life have rights to exist, to thrive, to regenerate, and to maintain their vital integral systems, because we are in reality all one universal system. We also recognize that the legal structure and laws actually define how we as humans relate to each other as society, and also how we relate to our planet. And it's a very important point, because a number of times people will say, why do we have to talk about rights? Why don't we really focus on responsibilities? Or, why do we have to use the term? For some, there's a big question of why we need to speak in terms of rights. And the reason we speak in terms of rights with respect to rights of nature is that that's the terminology that is integral to our legal systems that define how we relate to each other. And what we are looking to do, because we are looking to actually transform our relationship with our planet, we need to do that and by anchoring it in our legal systems. In fact, many of us talk and think of the rights of nature movement, certainly for those of us in the United States, as a continuation of the overall rights movement that started when we put our Constitution in place. Because at the time we put our Constitution in place, it speaks of all men being created equal, but we as women didn't have the right to own property or to vote, and our black Americans were many of them were bound in slavery, and it's taken 150 years for us to get to the point where we actually have a level of equality based on whether it's your gender or your race or your creed or ethnicity and even sexuality. So the next step we see is to expand our working definition to include all life. So when we talk about rights of nature, it is in effect the recognition and the honoring that the ecosystems that sustain us have the right to exist, to flourish, and to maintain their vital cycles and to regenerate. And today's legal system in the United States, and it's a structure that's been adopted around the world, is actually based on the premise that our natural systems, our ecosystems, are property. And how we deal with property is actually defined by the commercial code. And therefore, nature, our natural communities, are treated as objects under the law. They do not have any standing in a court of law. And by that I mean that there's a case that occurred in the early 70s, the Mineral King Valley, which I think is an excellent example, where the Disney organization wanted to build a very large ski resort in pristine Sierra Mountain Valley, and the Sierra Club came forward and went to court, challenging the development, trying to get it stopped. And the original court and even the appeals courts up through the Supreme Court threw it out on the grounds that Sierra Club members had no ownership and therefore had no standing and would not be directly impacted negatively by this development. Therefore, they had no standing to take the case forward, and so the case kept getting thrown out. However, Chief Justice William O. Douglas had just read an article that a professor of environmental law out of Southern California, Christopher Stone, had written an article stating with the question, should trees have standing toward legal rights for natural objects, and had it published in a law review that he knew that William O. Douglas would be reading. And Douglas wrote a minority report simply stating that had the U.S. law recognized rights of the ecosystem, rights of this valley that was going to be developed, that the ruling would have been very different. And that was the beginning of a recognition in the United States and a discourse around the idea that natural communities should be recognized as a subject under the law and a rights-bearing entity. It took many years for us to see some changes in that. But before I go into what happened in 2006, let me also just, in the document that I gave you, I want to highlight just a couple points, and that is, under current law, as I said, nature is treated as property. We think of it as natural resources for human consumption, which, as you know, our indigenous brothers and sisters think in terms of relations. And natural ecosystems are treated as objects, not subjects. And when damages, if someone takes a case forward that where damages are awarded because an ecosystem is being damaged, under the current law, those damages are actually being awarded to the individual or the entity that has standing or who's the owner of that property. And they can then decide what they do with those monies that are being awarded as damages. They don't necessarily have to use those damages to repair the ecosystem. And they are being actually assigned to make the property owner whole rather than the affected ecosystem. And it also, the way our whole environmental legal system, the Environmental Protection Act and the Clean Water Act, all of these define a set of regulations and limits that, in essence, say you can do this much damage, as opposed to saying, I am ensuring that whatever we're doing, we are obligated to ensure the health and well-being of the ecosystem. When we look at a rights of nature-based law, it starts from the premise that nature has rights to exist, has rights on the same level as we as humans to exist. And it presumes that we as humans and our government agencies have a responsibility to protect those rights, much in the same way that that we assign guardians to protect the rights of children. There's an assumption that a guardian role will be assumed by citizens or by a government agency. And actually, as the laws are being rolled out, that assignment is up to the community or the country in terms of who actually has that role as a guardian. But it is assigned to humans and government agencies. And a key difference then is that when damages are being granted or monies are assigned, those damages are specifically assigned to restore the ecosystem. There's a case in Ecuador. Ecuador is the first country in the world to implement rights of nature in their constitution. And about 2 years ago, the Vilcabamba River was being damaged by a development activity where construction materials were being dumped into the river, and it was blocking the river and stopping the overall flow. And community members went forward, took the case forward in the Ecuadorian courts, and the judge ruled in favor of the river. And therefore, the damages that were assigned had to be applied to repairing the damage that the river had incurred because of the development activities. So it instead of setting limits to how much damage can be done, it actually codifies the concept, which is very similar to the precautionary principle in terms of saying the responsibility of the entity doing development or whatever is going on is to ensure the well-being. And I think if you step back and look at it, you can begin to recognize there's a very significant difference in where you're starting from when you recognize your responsibility is to ensure the well-being of an ecosystem as opposed to I can only do so much damage. I also want to point out that human rights and rights of nature go hand in hand. I personally believe that you can't truly recognize the full effect of human rights without recognizing the rights of nature because of the depth of the interdependencies that we as humans share on this planet. I look at it, we are of this earth, not on this earth. But it is also not the same as human rights to nature. We certainly as humans have a natural right to clean air, clean water. But rights of nature recognizes that the ecosystems, our planet itself, has the same right to clean air and clean water. So in the United States, the rights of nature movement actually took hold in 2006 in Tamaqua Borough, Pennsylvania. I also want to point out that the Central Valley of Pennsylvania, where the rights of nature movement started or took hold in the United States, is actually a very conservative area, and I say that because many people think that that it's a progressive movement, and it's actually a movement that transcends political boundaries, and both very conservative and more progressive communities are embracing it. But Tamaqua Borough was facing a situation where there was a coal mining community. A coal mine was being converted to a toxic waste dump, and dredging materials from the Hudson River and other rivers that had all sorts of toxins in them the plan was to dump them in this waste dump, and the community was concerned that it would leach into public lands and affect both the land and the aquifers in the area. There was also some large corporate hog farms that were looking to move into the area, and where you have 1,000 hogs in place, a big issue becomes the waste or the biosolids or the liquid sludge and how to dispose of that. And in North Carolina and South Carolina, where the farms had been originally, there were already dead spaces in the rivers and in the ocean front around it related to this. And the agricultural industry was saying, well, we can convert it into fertilizer and put it on crops. And they actually had several children who got very sick because of the practice, and 2 young boys actually died. And so the community was up in arms saying, we don't want the toxic waste dump, we don't want the sludge, and we as a community believe we have the right to take this stand. They started through a process of trying to stop the permit process of several of these projects, and the corporations just kept coming back and were getting better at the permit process, and so they realized that they needed to get out of the box and a new level of thinking. And Thomas Lindsay and the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund were working with them and recognized that what they needed to do was to reaffirm their rights, because federal and state government have preemptive rights authority when it comes to certain laws, but when it comes to rights and the Bill of Rights and community rights, there are limits as to what the actions that the state and federal government can take. And so what they did was they defined a local ordinance that has 3 key elements to it. The first element is reasserting their right as a community to decide what goes on within their community. And they also said within our community, we do not recognize corporate personhood rights. We want to limit the corporate personhood rights. And we recognize the rights of the natural communities to be healthy and to not be contaminated by the toxins that they knew were being introduced. And that ordinance was put in place in 2006. And since then, over 36 communities, including Pittsburgh, which in 2010 was facing hydrofracking within their city. And you may or may not know that there are 3 rivers that converge in Pittsburgh, and under the city is a 4th river that is a large aquifer. And they were concerned that hydrofracking would contaminate the rivers and the land. And so they put in place an aquifer to prevent hydrofracking within the city. And to date, while there are threats of challenges, these ordinances are in place. In 2008, Ecuador was rewriting their constitution, and they became the first country to include rights of nature in its constitution. And they did that because Ecuador is the home of, they have the upper Amazon Valley, the Andes, a beautiful coastal area, as well as the Galapagos Islands. And so throughout their history, they have been the custodians of fragile ecosystems and have been under threat. Many of you are probably aware of the Chevron Texaco case, where the rainforest was heavily polluted, and they're still fighting that. And so they put in their constitution rights of nature to have another tool to help protect their ecosystems. And then in 2010, the Copenhagen Kyoto Protocol conference it was a shambles. And as you know, the Kyoto Protocol had the United States and the other powers refused to adopt it. And Evo Morales, who is president of Bolivia, heard the cry of the grassroots and said, we're going to have a Congress on climate change and rights of Mother Earth in April 2010. 35,000, some of you, including myself, were at that conference where we adopted the Universal Declaration for Rights of Mother Earth with the intention that that would be adopted by the UN. The UN has yet to really deal with it, but Bolivia has implemented their law of Mother Earth and are in the process of implementing it. Both Ecuador and Bolivia are facing some challenges in terms of implementing rights of nature, but the tool is in place, and it's a very significant movement. And as you know, the rights and responsibilities for future generations, at one of the fundamental principles that we've incorporated is the recognition of rights of nature for all species and for all elements. And so they're very tightly interconnected. And also, one question was the Ecocide campaign. And there is, many of you are aware of the Eradicating Ecocide campaign. And ecocide is essentially the recognition of the destruction or loss of an ecosystem, whether it's human-caused or other caused. It doesn't, the verbiage around ecocide doesn't as clearly describe a recognition of rights of nature, but when Polly Higgins and the key advocates of ecocide talk about inhabitants, they are referring to the inhabitants of all things and all beings, not just humans. And the intention of the eradicating ecocide is to put at an international level a tribunal that could serve as a council to convict or to put pressures on individuals and corporations and governments in cases where the environment is being damaged, and would become a very, very powerful international tool for raising consciousness and preventing much of the damage that is, and holding corporations and the executives of those corporations accountable, and individuals accountable for damages that we're seeing around the world. I've also included a number of websites as references, because the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature is a network of organizations and individuals from around the world who are advocating globally for the recognition of rights of nature. And we have a website. I've also included the CELDEF and Earth Law Center, because they're very active and have a website that is up to date continually. And then there's some other articles. I've also included a timeline. I've highlighted some of the key points of the timeline, but I'll also note that not only have individual communities recognized rights of nature, Vermont is moving forward on a city-by-city basis, ratifying resolutions saying we want our Constitution to include rights of nature. Santa Monica has included rights of nature in their sustainable city plan. They passed that just earlier this year, and are now in the process of saying, what does that mean as a city for us? And then earlier this year, Mora County, New Mexico, became the first county in the United States to adopt rights of nature. There's also a reference to a video just in the last week or 2 weeks. The Women's Earth and Climate Caucus had a major conference of 100 women from around the world, and there is a wonderful interview with Natalia Green, who is a key advocate from Ecuador, Shannon Biggs, who is a key rights of nature advocate with Global Exchange, as well as Patricia Ralingua, who is an indigenous leader from Sariacu, Ecuador, talking about rights of nature, and they were moderated by Osprey Oriole Lake, and they address many of the questions that frequently come up. So it's an hour-long video, which I think would be very helpful. And with that, Caitlin, I'm ready to open it up for questions or comments or whatever.
All right. Wonderful. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Robin? I'll go ahead and start, actually. Robin, I'm so curious if, and it might be addressed in the video you just mentioned, but in your experience, I mean, you've been working with this concept for quite some time. When you first present it to someone who is unfamiliar with the concept, have you noticed any patterns in the barriers to acceptance? I mean, in other words, have you noticed anything in particular that people have a hard time wrapping their mind around? Is it something common that you could maybe share with us as kind of a barrier to spreading these ideas that would be helpful for any conversations we might have with colleagues or friends when we're talking about this idea?
Sure. It's a great question. First of all, let me also address the concept of rights of Mother Earth because it also relates to your question. And we use rights of nature and rights of Mother Earth fairly interchangeably. And I say that with a little bit with some caution because technically, in the Ecuadorian Constitution, they refer to rights of nature as well as Pachamama, which is an indigenous word for Mother Earth. They speak to both of those in terms of what they're recognizing. And when we talk about Mother Earth, it connotes the sacred connection that we have with our planet. And so when quite honestly, I listen to who I'm speaking with as to whether I would talk in terms of rights of nature or rights of Mother Earth. People who resonate deeply with Mother Earth, I speak in terms of rights of Mother Earth, and within that community, some of the questions that come up are, and Patricia Walingwa, as well as Tom Gultooth and Daniel Wildcat, three people who I quote frequently, are very quick to say, when you recognize the sacredness of our connection with all of life, then in that context, everyone has equal rights. And so it's some communities don't even have a word for rights. In fact, that's a point that Natty and Patricia make in Ecuador. Some of the indigenous communities, and I believe it's true with some of the North American indigenous communities, they don't really have a word for rights. It's not part of their native language and has only come up as a word, an important word, with respect to how they're dealing with modern legal systems. So that's one. And it's in that context that people also say, we really should be looking at not necessarily not our rights, but our responsibilities and our duties in terms of our role as custodians of nature, and also the concept that we in the modern industrialized society, we look at nature as natural. We talk in terms of natural resources, and in indigenous communities, people think in terms of relations. Our relation, the wind, the air, the trees, the flower, the rock, are all relations. And so that also adds to the thinking of we should be talking in terms of responsibilities. When I speak in terms of rights of nature among people who come from who are more removed from their indigenous roots, I'm not sure exactly the words I want to say in terms of describing that, but those of us who come from European ancestry and who hold religious values around humans' relationship to God and man's dominion over nature. In some aspects, there's some, the looking at how do we shift that value into really recognizing that as humans, we have this responsibility and stewardship role. And then the other area is most people, and I don't care what your background is, most people resonate with the recognition that we as humans have a very sacred relationship with our planet, and that it is time, given the condition of our planet, people are waking up to the recognition that we need to restore natural balance, and we need to recognize our rightful place on this planet. And so from that context, they resonate deeply with the recognition that all life has the right to exist and to replenish itself, and that it's necessary that we honor that. The question becomes, what do we do with it? Because even in my own community in Northern California, where we look at what can we do with rights of nature, taking the step to create an ordinance and get the local buy-in and agreement to take it far enough to get it passed takes a lot of savvy. As you know, many of you are activists, social justice activists, and you know what it takes. The general population, not everybody is ready to take that step and do the work that it takes to really make changes to our legal systems. So that was a long answer. Have I addressed it for you?
Yes, thank you so much. And anyone else, just a reminder, you can press *6 to unmute if you have anything to say you want to bring up.
Hi, Robin. This is Melinda Hemmelgarn. I'm based in Columbia, Missouri, and I wanted to just ask if there were perhaps model steps to take to create ordinances. I think so many of us feel frustrated with what we see in our communities, but as you so astutely mentioned, you know, we really don't know the steps to take. And I remember my background is nutrition and human health, so I remember years ago there was a guidebook of GEMS. It was put out through a nutrition education group, and what they did was they basically gave how-to steps where people saw a problem and they outlined for others how they accomplished a solution. So those were the GEMS. And I wonder, you know, there are two situations in my own community. One, I live in a city that is supposed to be very progressive, but is about to destroy a beautiful natural area to build ballparks and soccer fields. And I only know about this because I have a child who is working in Parks and Recreation. And, you know, what happens is when you go up against something that's good for something that's good, you may risk losing your employment. Similar situation with a daughter. My children work for me too. You know, we're all in this together. But my daughter was substitute teaching in a classroom that had an ABC poster on the wall that had rather than A is for apple, B is for boy, it was logos, brand logos for corporate institutions. So W was for Walmart, M was for McDonald's. To intervene and say, whoa, this isn't right, it would maybe risk her employment working in the school system. So do you know what I'm saying? It's like we recognize that these things are happening in our community. Intervening has a price, and I wonder if there are examples of successful solutions.
Well, you know, especially when you're dealing with things such as, which for a community can recognize the value of recreational areas, and, you know, we put a priority. I can imagine that that's a harder issue to leverage than something like fracking or even in Mount Shasta had a case where they were moving forward because PG&E was seeding the clouds. So, and in communities where you're facing fracking or egregious agricultural issues or other toxic waste, then it's easier to build a momentum in terms of the capturing the outrage and shifting that into conscious action. There are on the CELDF, and your request for specific how-to steps is it's a very good question because, and I'm making a note that it's a document that we as a Global Alliance community would be a good one for us to develop. Though there are several documents that I would steer you to. One is a book by Thomas Lindsay and Annika Campbell. It was published in 2009. It's called Be the Change, How to Get What You Want in Your Community. And it talks about the issues that various communities, including the Tamako Borough and other communities, have faced, and the work that CELDF has been doing with them. And you can find a reference to that on celdf.org, CELDF.org/publications. And publications has an S on the end, and it's all lowercase. And there are several papers in there in terms of that could be helpful to you.
And I'd like to add, this is Carolyn Raffensperger.
Yeah.
Some of the steps that we laid out in the precautionary principle in the last call are good ways to engage communities in conversations. What's the goal? What kinds of warnings do you have, early warnings? What are the better alternatives? Are there alternatives to destroying those natural areas and putting in the ballparks there? And so there's some steps that are logical and that aren't the usual way that we go about voting up or down an activity like putting in a ballpark. And I think that those are helpful steps. And I think that there are some useful ideas embedded in the Declaration around the rights of future generations, where you could imagine doing something creative like appointing a legal guardian for future generations in your community and having a conversation about that, which is very proactive and very visionary in terms of looking at what you want to leave your kids and protecting that vast and beautiful world around us for them in a healthy legacy.
Thanks for that reminder.
Yeah, Carolyn, that's a great point. In fact, those of us in Northern California, when we had our gathering, we actually have been talking about defining for ourselves, just declaring ourselves as a guardian and showing up at city council meetings where we know that issues such as a ballpark or some other decision is going to be made, and declaring, standing up and speaking and just saying, I am here to speak as a guardian for this forested area or for this preserve or for this piece of property.
Another thing that guardians can do, and in the work that we've done on it, there are at least two things, if not many others. One is to review regulations and comment on their impact on future generations, and the other is to do an audit of the commons. And that's something that communities can do together. You can map them, you can inventory them, you can assess their health, and report on that to your community. Have it reported as part of the budget. And when you do that, then those natural areas and parks and waterways and migratory butterflies are part of the shared commons and the commonwealth. And when you inventory those things, it makes them visible as part of that shared wealth. And then preparing plans for turning them over in good shape. And I think those kinds of ideas lead to ordinances. Short of a major threat, the way Tamaqua Borough was faced with, people aren't ready to do something dramatic. But these ways of seeing the treasures in your community and agreeing that they should be shared and passed on, and air and water, clean air and clean water, migratory and other wildlife, those all are so essential for our well-being. And so doing that kind of commons audit is a joyful way of starting this kind of process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, in my community, that's a wonderful point. In my community, the South Yuba River runs through here as a beautiful canyon. And a number of years ago, there were various threats that were going on, and a citizens committee came together and said, we want to do some things such as, we want to protect the Yuba, we want to clean it up, clean up the trash and debris and all those sorts of things. And it has evolved into a very, very strong organization. But it started very small. And to, pull together even a small group of friends who care about the area to begin doing some of the work that just creating public awareness, as Carolyn is talking about, that could then help align, some further scientific studies to do the audit. But it can start small, and I'm fine. Most people they're just not awake to or recognize the impact of what's getting ready to happen. And if you begin talking about it in a very, intelligent, thoughtful way, then you'll be surprised who will embrace it.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that you can do is look at your state constitution and any documents that create your town, because many of the states, most of them have some language around the state's responsibility to serve as the trustee of the commons of the natural world, and so using those as an argument for the responsibility and role of government is at least an entree into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
This is Christy. I just wanted to report something that about 6 months ago I did stand up in a city council meeting to speak as a potential bearer of future generations, as a guardian, to assert to a Blue Castle Holdings that are trying to put a nuclear reactor on the Green River, to say that they simply have no right to do so, citing the rights of future generations as legal standing in their own right, just asserting it. Since then, there is a effort to, there's a lawsuit that is trying to stop this reactor project, and so I want to thank you very much for putting this, for sharpening it to the point that I can now go with this group to assert these rights in a lawsuit against them, citing things like the critical habitats, etc. So I think that there are already some threads that are able to testify for things like endangered species with the EPA, etc. But it doesn't go far enough, and this will help a great deal to help reframe exactly why human beings belong in relationship with everything else. It's an uphill battle, though, because of everything we already know. We're up against the state and the federal level about saying that our needs for energy are not have no right to supersede And I think that that's very difficult to break into a mind frame. That's where I am. It's more of a consciousness issue. There are already threads legally, and this will help a lot. But how do you talk or make headway when it's a point of view that's so spiritual? That's where I'm working today. I was laughed out of that meeting, by the way, when I said they have no right. Literally laughed. So, just reporting.
Are they laughing still with the national park shutdown?
No, in fact, what they're doing is a lot of the conservatives what they're doing is trying to take over the national parks, and it's just a disconnect that's so vast that I think we have to just write off a certain number of those. We say, why can't we reach you? Why can't we do this? We just have to sort of plow ahead and say, okay, well, if we can't get you, we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to show up at these meetings and keep on doing it. And it's sort of war, really. And this timeline and all of that hard work to get it down to something that is able to assert the rights will help a lot. We just show up with it and say, this word has more power. And I think we just have to create the groundswell.
This is Sharon Raji Maynard in Seattle. And some of the research that has come across my desk, I worked with and hosted the Women's Grassroots Congress, which we met in March of the year you guys first met, laid down an agenda of values. But research that's just come across my desk in the last few months, and I didn't catch it, and I'm going to say it to you, hoping that somebody else might know the source. That the newest research says that instead of the 33% we thought it would take for women to be at a decision-making table and be heard, they're now saying that it isn't until about 67% that women then will be heard. And anything less than that, especially at one person like you were, will be laughed at, will be discredited, will be treated poorly, will be made fun of. And it isn't until we stand in numbers that then there's the research is showing that we are heard. And I think that's important to understand that, one voice and then, like you say, not getting people convinced. Get those who are already convinced to come with you the next time and the next time and the next time. We have to hold hands across issues even, because it's a value-based agenda we need. And that includes the rights of good life for all in the web of life. So
thank you.
That is such an interesting statistic.
It is, and I didn't capture it, and I've been looking for it ever since. But boy, it made perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, I just want to interject that the best thing about getting older is that I seem to humiliate less easily.
Yeah.
So right? So
yeah, I didn't care.
Yeah. But years ago I might have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for speaking out, even when we're laughed at, and I had a similar experience on a GMO panel where I was clearly outnumbered, I think we set an example for younger women by having the strength to speak up even when we're laughed at publicly.
I will also add, this is Robin, I recently have watched the movie A Fierce Green Fire. I believe it's Fierce Green Fire, which is a very powerful documentary of the environmental movement. And in it, one of the the story of the creation of Greenpeace and the fact that when they first organized, they had a very strong nonviolent, that their role was going to be nonviolent action. And they were one of the founders, Bob, I'm forgetting his name, but was on a boat, a small boat, between a group of whales and a Russian harpoon whaling vessel. And they were trying to keep the Russians from being able to shoot their harpoons, and finally the Russians just said, "We're shooting," and one of the whales, as it was dying and just crying out, looked straight into his eye. And in that moment, what he got was he didn't care what anyone else thought about the actions he was going to take. He was going to do whatever he needed to, and he was working on behalf of the whales. And so he created Sea Shepherds, and which is a more aggressive protection organization. And I mean, he to this day will say, "I don't care what humans say. I'm not working for humans. I'm working for the whales." And I think if we take this, really recognize that we are standing for future generations, and I don't care what elements of the current industrial society thinks, I am standing for future generations, then, it creates a tougher skin for us just automatically. And I've been very empowered by his story. And
thank you.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We are at the hour. Of course, does anyone else have anything they'd like to add before we sign off? I don't want to keep anybody beyond the hour, but if anybody wants to add their thoughts or questions before we all sign off, please.
This is Rebecca. This is Rebecca Power in Madison, Wisconsin. I joined a little bit late, but I did have a quick question. Are there any examples of commons audits that you could point us to?
Robin, I don't know if you heard that question, but she wanted to know if there was...
Well, okay. I have an example, but you wouldn't want... I don't want to... my community did an audit a number of years ago, and it was a very painful process because the property rights people thought it was an attack on them. But so I wouldn't want to give mine. Carolyn, are you still on? Do you have a... I think we may have lost Carolyn, and
okay.
Well, I'll go back to Carolyn and see if I can come up with some examples, and we'll feed that to Caitlin.
That would
be great.
Yep, and a friendly reminder to everyone: all of these resources are available on that declaration blog. So as soon as we get that, we'll load it up for everyone.
And I also, because the property rights is such a volatile position for people to take, and it is one of the, counter arguments. And we are actually, if you really look at rights of nature, we are actually expanding one's ability to protect their own property rights. Not everyone sees that. But it really is the case. And we're not trying to say, no, you can't cut down a specific tree. Mm-hmm. What we're really saying is, as we do our development, as we put in place ballparks and new housing developments and other, developments, what we're saying is, look at the overall impact to the community, to the environment, and make your decisions based on that, rather than continuing to push for, profit at all costs.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Robin, thank you again. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll hold our next briefing call in a month, so you'll be getting the announcements about that.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.